something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to American Exception. I'm Aaron Good. This is the excerpted first portion of a full episode of the American Exception podcast. If you would like to view or listen to the rest of the episode, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. We have hundreds of episodes available for subscribers. If you want to better understand the deep politics and history of the U.S. Empire, American Exception is the best place to go. The URL is patreon.com/AmericanException. Subscribe if you can, and either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. Sarah Kendzior, it's great to have you back.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now, we spoke, I don't know, maybe it was a year and a half ago or something like that, and it was pretty grim then, as it has been for the 21st century in the U.S. It's not improved. It's actually, we've reached a new low, I think, in terms of the horrors of living under this decaying empire. And you wrote a book that I think captures, in a way, the desperation of this time. The title does, The Last American Road Trip. So could you talk a little bit about this book and how you have been dealing with the times that we're living through?
Yeah. Well, The Last American Road Trip is about a series of trips I made with my husband and children between 2016 and 2024 over a changing America. And the reason it's called that is because every single time we left, I wondered if this was the same time we would be able to do this, to travel freely as a family, to see national parks, national monuments. It was important to me, you know, when my kids were young when they started this, now they're in their late teens, for my children to see this country with their own eyes and kind of shrug off stereotypes and generalizations. And so, you know, of course, this is a tumultuous 8-year period. I showed them everything from some of the most, you know, beautiful landscapes of our country to the Mena, Arkansas airport where Iran-Contra took place. So it really spans a lot of different types of sites, a lot of different sorts of discussions were took place this way. But for it to come out this year, I wrote it in 2023 mostly, and then it came out in 2025 in a year where I think my most dire kind of predictions or assumptions in the book, have been unfortunately, vindicated as true. You know, I am worried about freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. We are seeing an attack on national parks. We're seeing our national history become rewritten. We're seeing censorship at a level that I don't think we've seen before, in part because there's digital technology that didn't exist before. So, very, very, very grim times.
Right, and as you were traveling and you start to see the country through a kind of grimmer historical lens compared to the way you looked at the country before, I mean, this is something we've all been going through if we're aware of how dark the real top of the power structure in the U.S. is, which you can't grasp when you're younger. You know, how has your perception of just regular people changed in the U.S.? Because I'm really less interested in even wanting to think about like, oh, these right-wing people, that we live in a right-wing nightmare and it's because of right-wing Americans. I don't really think of it that way. I mean, I think we live in a right-wing nightmare of corporate, mobbed up imperialism, but it doesn't what we think, we're just neutralized, right? So what do you think when you see Americans and that are just regular people? How has it changed your sort of perception of people that you run into? Because this is something that I've thought about a bit myself. I am kind of more sympathetic even to people that sort of annoy me on some level these days, because I feel like, God, we've all just been subjected to brain scrambling cultural, bullshit our whole lives.
Yeah,
I'm kind of rambling, but you get what I'm saying. Like, you start to think about the people that you meet, and it's like, God, we've all been subjected to like some kind of big MK Ultra project our whole lives.
Well, yeah. And then also in terms of right wing, like, I live in Missouri. Like, I've lived in Missouri for over 2 decades. I brought my kids up in Missouri, and I've watched Missouri change, and I've watched it become the experimental playground of dark money, even predating Citizens United. And so when people will say things like, oh, you voted for this, meaning either me, like not me personally, but people who live in Missouri or Americans, I'm like, yeah, right. Because for a very long time, I don't think we've had legitimate elections at the top. I also don't think people have very much power. They just generally don't structurally, unless they're in this extremely small elite. We now, of course, have a time where, foreign actors are pouring enormous amounts of money into our elections. There's uncontrolled spending, and there's just collective suffering. I've written many times, going back to my first book, The View from Flyover Country, which was essays I wrote between 2012 and 2014, that there's no such thing as red or blue America, that America is purple. It's purple like a bruise. We're held together through collective pain. And what they do, what these oligarchs and plutocrats do is pit people against each other using these categories of red and blue that were devised during the 2000 presidential election that do not actually have a long history. There's no fixed identity for any state. And so I've always enjoyed just driving around the country and talking to like regular people about, the towns they live in, the experiences they had, the things they like to do there. That was never sort of where my anger has been placed. Obviously if someone's like an asshole, they're an asshole, and that's that. But who has the power in this situation? Like, it's not, your average everyday voter, even if they voted for people who I personally can't stand. They're not the ones holding the power, but they really, really want to drill into our heads that is the case.
Right. Yeah, they really want you to be a part of this partisan sort of pro wrestling spectacle that we get, and both parties are so discredited at this point. It's really something. The Democrats have become more and more. I mean, under Biden, it was completely absurd what the U.S. was doing, but foreign policy wise. I mean, this war that you can't win in Ukraine, for to expand, to put a beachhead there. It's like these beachheads that we put up that really shouldn't have been there in the first place. Taiwan, Palestine, occupied Palestine, and Ukraine. These are places that we're trying to set up as beachheads for for a forever war, essentially, against Eurasia, and it can't be justified if you talk about it honestly.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, they wonder about the motives behind it because they're looking at the politicians, they're looking at members of Congress, they're looking at policies that go through, and they're not looking at the donors and the money behind them. And I think there's, also a gap in understanding that increased under Biden, because during that time, so many articles and news sources either went out of business or became paywalled or were suppressed by algorithms, especially after Musk bought Twitter. So people became less and less informed, and also I think less curious, more afraid about trying to get to the roots of why all of these international conflicts are happening, why certain actors are able to behave with utter impunity, never punished for their crimes, even when they confess to them, who is in an alliance with who. It's frustrating, because like you said, they wanted this pro wrestling drama instead, this sort of DOJ infotainment complex revolving entirely around the question of, is Trump going to be indicted? Is Trump going to go to prison? Or is Trump going to be the president again? Which is what I kept saying was going to happen, like that we were heading for a reinstallation and that this was obvious by 2021. And then, of course, you see Biden continuing a lot of the worst policies of Trump, continuing COVID policies, continuing anti-migrant policies, building the wall, obviously continuing the worst policies on Israel, backing Israel in its genocide. And so, and then also new things, creating cop cities, creating an environment, or at least facilitating it and allowing right-wing actors also to create an environment where they're moving kind of people's perceptions to a much crueler and more far right-wing direction, so that Trump can very neatly slide back in and just go full throttle the moment that he arrives, which took a lot of people aback. I think they thought that he would move slower, but everything's already in place from his first term and then from Biden's term, which also serves the purpose, I think, of getting liberals to become very quiet about a lot of civil rights issues that they had once cared about when it was Trump as the president, and then they suddenly stopped talking about them when Biden is, and also a lot of corruption issues that they were once up in arms about, and again became very quiet because, God forbid, you criticize the Democrats, you criticize Biden or the democratically controlled Senate, the democratically controlled House, you ask them to do anything in like their job or to serve the public or to hold elite criminals accountable, then you would be attacked. They would attack ordinary people for asking politicians to do their job. And that slowed down the process, I think, of transparency. And when the process of transparency is slowed down, the road to accountability is blocked.
Right. And as looking back on this history, I wrote a whole dissertation on the evolution of the American deep state, and I tied it to the oligarchy as the driving force, the private wealth, but also the intelligence agencies and their relationship to organized crime. And I didn't totally understand it at the time, even though I'd read Peter's work, and he'd written about like Lansky compared to like the Hoover ideas of the Italian mafia. But then reading it again, I just saw more, and doing some more research on my own, there are all these, it's pretty clear that Lansky was an Israeli, an asset of Israel. And in 1941, he is recruited by the ONI and the OSS for Operation Underworld, and he springs his partner Luciano from prison, and that's the National Crime Syndicate.
Yes.
And they, in 1945, for their efforts, for his efforts, Lansky's given the Medal of Freedom by Truman. He also sets up that same year a new drug connection in Mexico, run by this guy Harold Meltzer, with Lansky money, and it's for that reason that he founds Las Vegas, like in 1946, and then it just turns it because they needed to launder the money from the Mexican drug connection, and it's close to L.A. And it's a very useful spot, and so they take over the National Racing Wire. They make connections with the Teamsters, so that they take over the Teamster pension funds with this murder that takes place in 1939. That eventually the syndicate gets control of the Teamster funds. And when that murder took place, one of the suspects was Jack Ruby, who was in the room at the time, and he was arrested and probably turned into some kind of informant at that point. But anyway, there's this whole backstory of the mob that the only person to go after it really was RFK. Mm-hmm. But you know what happened to him. He went after the Teamsters, Hoffa and the Teamsters, and the Las Vegas. He wanted to have this big raid on the Las Vegas casinos, but because the governor was a Democrat, it didn't end up happening. But this history of organized crime in Hoffa and Vegas, Lansky, this has been like forgotten. We just have this Godfather fairy tale instead. What is your take on the role of organized crime as being not this thing outside the system, but really a part of our system of governance?
Yeah, this is something I've emphasized heavily from the start, especially when Trump took power, because I felt like people were not understanding this properly. They were reducing everything to the rise of one man, where this is really about a network. And this is about a person, Trump, who has been embedded in a transnational criminal network for his entire life, through his real estate industry deals, but also through ties to people, in government and entertainment and business. that were all tied to organized crime. And this is an era in which, or, in like the 1980s and 1990s, where organized crime was getting streamlined into white collar crime to the point that people didn't even recognize it as crime. They would maybe call it corruption, but they would usually just call it life. And the antecedents of this, the roots of all of this, the story of Lansky's rise, even the story of somebody like, Roy Cohn, who was Trump's mentor, but who was also heavily influenced by Lansky, and Lansky's goal, of making organized crime simply business, beyond the realm of prosecution, is blocked out. There is very little mainstream literature written about this, in terms of that compares to the weight that those two figures had in shaping 20th century American history. Because I think Lansky and Roy Cohn, are two of the most influential Americans, bar none. And it's not a contest. But when I was writing my previous book, They Knew, it was difficult to research both. I was getting a lot of out of print books by people like Hank Messick on Lansky. I was struggling to find a lot of sources that at one point, in the 60s and the 70s, had been national bestsellers. These weren't books that had always been obscure. These were books that were pushed into obscurity. The same is true of Robert Friedman's books, Red Mafia, or his book on Meyer Kahane. And you would think in this era of, digital media and so many sort of forgotten or played down works coming to light that I would have had, a wealth of information at my disposal. And in the beginning of writing that book in 2020, 2021, that was kind of true. And then as I wrote it, I watched a lot of these sources just disappear or become more difficult to find. And now in 2025, I think, my ability to write either They Knew or my book Hiding in Plain Sight, which also is about transnational organized crime, it would be almost impossible because there's been so much of an erasure of history. We had this window, we had this kind of bright shining window for a while where both of us as researchers, as well as other researchers, were able to delve deep into a lot of things that were made public, either through the opening of archives and, easier financial availability, or because people were simply sharing information with each other. Now there's, a surveillance panopticon, there are paywalls, there are sites that have simply been wiped off the internet, articles that no longer exist, government documents that are either redacted in a selective or manipulated manner, or they don't exist either. It's frustrating, but yeah, I agree with you that the modern crisis, the sort of post-World War II America, was shaped by Meyer Lansky, and it should just be examined as a part of American history in the same way that, anything else significant, from that period onward is. It is a part of the story, and it's notable to me, the depth to which it's ignored and forgotten.
Right, and it's just something that social science doesn't have a way of looking at very well. I wrote about the exception, as a concept, really a Nazi concept, Carl Schmitt, right? It's the state's in danger. What do you do? Well, you have to take extraordinary measures. You can't be loyal to the law or conform to the law if it's going to mean that the state will be destroyed, because that's an existential crisis. So the state has to act. But something else that I think is related to that I tried to conceptualize in a recent talk that I gave is the idea of the fix, the sort of something where in the political economy where a massive rent-seeking arrangement is for criminal activity is essentially protected from authorities for an extended period of time. It's like a racket, right? We call it a racket, and that this is a key concept when you to look at, and nothing embodies it more than Lansky, who was protected by. He worked with Louis Buck to help the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the FBI arrest and convict this guy named Louis Buckhalter in 1937 or 39, and this apparently endeared him with Hoover and Anslinger. And Anslinger, by the way, ran the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he was married to a Mellon, someone in the Mellon family, which is today a big backer of Trump, which, very interesting. But Lansky wrote, or he either said this, or I guess he said it to someone, and they mention it in the Sally Denton book, The Money and the Power on Vegas, that Lansky said, he wasn't so much into gambling because he saw it as like he could easily lose and so on. And he watched these card games and craps games, and he realized that the position you wanted to be in was the person that ran the game, because you always won, right? The casino, the house always wins. And so that was his model, to be the person that's controlling the game that's being played, because then you always win. And that model, he applies it to the National Crime Syndicate. He pays off whoever he has to. He co-ops whatever people he needs to. He gets sexual blackmail on whoever. Whatever you need to do to secure your place in the market and the protection from the authorities and the political establishment. And that model has took over the whole country. The whole stock market, Wall Street regulation, everything became a casino. And if you were the group that had the fix, you could do whatever. Everything was the way that money gets created, for example, the reforms to banking laws, getting rid of Glass-Steagall. These are all just kind of different ways to think of the fix. And it really is like the Lansky mentality of like, you just rig every game as much as you can, and that's the way to get ahead. And you corrupt the officials and do everything else in politics. This seems to have taken over the whole country. It's like Vegas became the whole country. It was created just to launder drug money, and now that mentality is the top of the U.S. power structure. It's everywhere.
Yeah, and I think people don't quite understand the depth of it. I mean, everyone knows, Washington, D.C. is a dirty place. Congress has corruption. Those are kind of mainstream American ideas that have been there for a long time. The degree to which it's rigged, I think, is something that people did not want to reckon with until recently, and often still don't. It's like the casino is right there, but they can't see it, or they're just seeing this sort of, whitewashed, it's, city of sin, kind of fun version of it. And they think that this can't possibly be as bad as it seems. It can't be as entrenched. Organized crime could not have possibly infiltrated American institutions to the degree that it had, because surely someone would have stopped it. And surely if there's something, for example, like the Epstein-Maxwell operation, infiltrating and corroding, institutions, blackmailing and bribing individuals, people wouldn't uniformly all keep their mouths shut about that and let him go free and not put a stop to it for decades and end. It's like, no, that is exactly what they will do, in part because they're protecting the institution. They're institutionalists, but they're protecting a broken and corrupt institution that they have helped build, or they have helped uphold for their careers. So they don't want to be, dragged down with it. It's the source of their power, but it also is, potentially the source of their shame or even their prosecution. But on top of that, I think we reached a point in which people really don't seem to have the agency to move out of this, even though the information in terms of organized crime control is more overt than before. You started seeing people, former heads of the FBI, going and working explicitly with what's called the Russian mafia, but is really a transnational mafia with a lot of figures who, were oligarchs who came from the former USSR, but are working in partnership with figures from Israel, from Gulf states, from the West. Bob Dole, for example, was a registered Kremlin agent under Farah shortly after he was running for presidential election. Like it became so mainstream that people almost couldn't see it. But what it did is it really sucked away opportunity and freedom and the chance at a better way of life from ordinary American people, kind of throughout our entire lifetimes, but I think especially picking up steam after the global financial collapse in 2008, which these plutocrats saw as a golden moment of opportunity. We saw COVID same way.
In some way. They may have staged the financial, it may have been orchestrated. When you look back at how they failed, they're like, oh, they failed, they made these mistakes, oh no. But then once the dust settles and you look at the outcome of it, there's as much capital in the world in a real sense, there's as much productive capacity as there was, but the financial way that it is arranged on everybody's bank accounts, the rich people, the oligarchs just owned way more, and the bottom 60% owned way less.
Yeah.
So it ultimately weakened the power, the ability of people to have any power or influence, or because wealth, it buys everything in this society. And so it's like it not only made him richer, but it weakened the political power and social power period of the majority of the population. Like this
Yeah,
is
that,
so,
and then I think credentialism and this purchased merit and nepotism. That was a time where you see the cost of college, rising exponentially. You see BA suddenly becoming a requirement for any kind of job, including jobs that didn't have it before. People can't afford the college degree; they get locked out of the job market. The Wall Street guys get bailed out. And then of course things like Citizens United just legalized the dark money kind of operations that had already existed, but made it permissible. And that's what we've seen more of in recent years. It's just a lot of things that always existed have just been codified in law, but that does make them more difficult to combat. Because I live in Missouri, I got the early preview of this, but now it's national, now it's federal. And the striking thing to me is that they don't have any interest, in my view, in the survival of the United States as a country. It is purely a landmass to them to strip down and sell for parts. I think they see people as disposable and in the way. And this differs a bit, I think, from previous presidencies, especially in the 20th century, where the goal was more imperial expansion. It was, like right now, many people are accurately saying we have a semi-authoritarian state under Trump. Some are calling it an authoritarian state. I don't think we're completely there yet, or you and I would not be having this conversation. But we're on the way. And so I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. maybe they're more successful than they think. But anyway, my point is that the type of dictatorship that people imagine tends to be in that 20th century vein, and that's not what we have. We have a mafia state. We have a kleptocracy, and we have a country governed by organized crime and by foreign interests, to the point that it's not even about America achieving or being the best. It's about America being destroyed from within, with regular people feeling great pain as a result of this destruction, and the wealthiest people and the most evil people, because honestly, I think there's just a level of evil in what they're doing that goes beyond what we've been accustomed to seeing, are benefiting at a level I don't think that they have before.
right. I mean, that's always been something about civilization, that it's been intertwined with imperialism, because otherwise you just have some sort of functional city state somewhere, like that they always expanded. So you
Right.
organize human societies in a way to be more complex and produce agriculture and systems of writing, but those become imperialistic. And so there's always that at the top. Once you have a more complex society with more distance between the top and the bottom, the people at the top have to be more pretty much indifferent to the humanity of the people at the bottom, and actually not even at the bottom, the vast majority of the people. They see them as kind of instrumental to their racket, or their place in society, their status, prestige, power. But we have taken it to another level in this age. I mean, the slaughter in Gaza that you see, throwing these Ukrainian lives away for nothing, that we have done, with the coup, the Maidan coup in the first place, and then letting this war go on and backing into the hilt. And they're like, oh, you got to help them. We put our flags out, as if you like the Ukrainian people and are helping them. You're destroying the whole generation, right? But they just don't care. But we seem to have taken it to another level of just not, with our elites, just not caring about people in the U.S. or even especially around the world. But there does seem to be something recently where the population, or enough people, are really outraged by it for symbolic reasons, for different reasons. But I'm talking about the Epstein case, because this seems to be something that, even with all of the criminality that goes on, that really dwarfs the scale of Epstein. Because really, it's the political economy that kills so many, millions of people year in, year out around the world that we police, and yet the Epstein thing, it doesn't go away. Why do you think the Epstein thing in particular is something that so many people won't let go of? I mean, I'm not saying they should, but I mean, of all the things that are going to make you anti the system as a whole, it's one of many. And yet it's become this big thing. What do you think is the reason for that?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote on Epstein in two of my books, in Hiding in Plain Sight, and then They Knew, which came out in 2022. I said, at this sick, sad point in our country, Epstein is the only thing holding Americans together, meaning that loathing for him, hatred for him, a common belief that he and Maxwell should be punished is something that is agreed upon, whether you are left or right, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't seem to matter. Everybody was in alignment on this. I think it's because it's explicit sadistic abuse of children. And it is also tied to the wealthiest and most powerful actors in the world who never face accountability for other crimes that they've committed. And I think a lot of people just see this as the ultimate manifestation of elite criminal impunity. And there becomes some hope in there that perhaps they will be taken down by this particular case, in part because there is such a large public push. I'm really wondering where that public push went during the Biden years, because I remember it, in the aftermath of Epstein's quote unquote suicide in 2019, there was a push for accountability. Then, of course, COVID appeared and people were distracted by that. But when I would bring this up during the Biden years, I'd catch hell from the Democratic Party, less so from the Republican Party, even though I was implicating a lot of Republicans. They did not want me to point out that the DOJ had the opportunity to educate the public about what Epstein and Maxwell had done. I thought it was notable that Biden had made Tony Blinken the Secretary of State when his stepfather was Samuel Pisar, who was the best friend of Robert Maxwell, the last person to see Robert Maxwell alive. Robert Maxwell is Ghislaine Maxwell's father. He was also an Israeli operative at such a high level that he had an elaborate state funeral in 1991 after he unexpectedly died after falling off a yacht. He was also tied to the Russian mafia. He was tied to a lot of, corporate crime. That much has been, all of this has really been made public. And so why in the world would you appoint that, the stepson of that guy's best friend and lawyer, who also, by the way, was Epstein's advisor after he was Maxwell's, as the Secretary of State? Because even if Blinken was like a saint, he could easily be compromised by just being so closely tied to the Maxwell family. And then you look at every administration and you see somebody very close to Epstein, somebody very pivotal to Epstein's rise in that administration. In the first Trump term, it's Bill Barr, whose father was the person who hired Epstein as a teacher, brought him into New York high society. From there, he took off in New York financial world. Under the second Trump term, it's Howard Lutnick, Epstein's close friend and next door neighbor. And I could just go through and pick, smaller people in lesser positions from all these administrations, and they're all tied to him. And it's in part because that was Epstein's business, is tying themselves to the wealthy and powerful. The wealthy and powerful then get hired for administrative positions, and nepotism rules this country. So you're going to see their sons and daughters showing up over and over again. And I think everyone hates this. I think the American public absolutely hates this entire system, and they see it embodied in this case. But it has been interesting to me that, especially in the last, basically since around July, it seems like it got picked up again. I remember when the suicide of one of Epstein's victims, Virginia Giuffre, happened. There was not a lot of press coverage or outrage. I think that was in April. And then suddenly in July, Epstein was everything. Epstein was everywhere again. I'm not sure how organic that interest is, but I do believe that people sincerely want this examined, and they understand that it didn't magically stop either with Epstein, that there's very, very likely a continual operation occurring. And they're also seeing, the genocide of children happening in Gaza every day. They're seeing abuses of children on a scale that we just have never been able to see because of the technology that we have. And so I think children are on people's minds, and the ability of the wealthy and powerful to hurt children are on people's minds. And I think that really is something that everyone with a conscience and a soul can agree on, is a monstrosity and needs to be stopped. That we have a government that doesn't just not stop it, they fund it, and they benefit from it, and they make it happen. And I think that that's a source of deep sadness for the average person.
Right, and the things that we know and yet cannot really be acted upon or made into a sort of prevailing will, they're staggering. I just did an interview with Sibel Edmonds, who was a FBI whistleblower, about really regarding 9/11 material, because she was used. They had her go back and translate a whole lot of things that had been marked as like not relevant or so on, and in that audio, among other things, some of which pertain to 9/11 and which are really spectacular. Her testimony is still top secret. You can't see it, and she was gagged by the State Secrets Act for years from when it comes to even talking about it. But one of the things that she found was that a conversation where they're talking about, oh yeah, Denny boy, we got a 14-year-old and 16-year-old virgin boys that we're gonna provide him with. And she talked to some of the other people in the FBI, and they said, oh yeah, Denny boy was Dennis Hastert, who was at that time the Speaker of the House. And so she found out that they had been essentially, among other things, they gave him campaign contributions of Turkish funds that were from the heroin traffic. And this got written up in a Vanity Fair article in 2005. So if it wasn't true, they could have sued David Rose and Vanity Fair for libel, but they didn't. They didn't say anything about it. So that was crazy enough what got printed, the heroin angle, right? The heroin cash angle got printed in Vanity Fair. But what Vanity Fair wouldn't print was what Sibel told David Rose, the reporter, about the pedophile blackmail business. With sort of Turkish and Israeli linked forces, but American Turkish relations. But it seems like the Turkish lobby was kind of an outpost of the neocon Israel lobby, more or less, right? Is sort of how it broke down. And they said, well, we're going to need 4 sources, or we're going to need more than 2 sources to confirm if we're going to print this about Hastert and the pedophilia blackmail. And they ended up getting 4 sources, 4 people to confirm this, and they still wouldn't print it. Mm-hmm. And then years later, I don't know what year, maybe 2011, it finally comes out that, well, Hastert had, back when he was a wrestling coach, he had sexually abused some boys. Because he was a high school wrestling coach before he became the number 3 person in line for the presidency at the Speaker of the House. He was a wrestling coach. But they didn't touch any of the things that had happened as he was out there. And I mean, this is the kind of world we live in, where you can rise to that position of power. How do you think this affects people trying to raise kids in a reasonable way when you look at this society?
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying. It's terrifying to me as a parent. It's terrifying for me when I think of other parents. When you look at the interviews, with Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell in particular, but also Epstein and all of their cohort, Alan Dershowitz and so forth, the way that they talk about the girls that they kidnapped and trafficked and raped, as human trash, as white trash, as garbage, as these disposable people who nobody would miss, is just, it's so unbelievably evil. It is so incredibly cruel. And I think it makes people feel like, their children are prey, to this overclass that can just do anything they want. They're never held accountable. Many of them have openly confessed to other crimes or, been indicted, but never faced real consequences for that. And so it's a very scary world. It's also scary to think that there are so many powerful officials that simply witnessed this. They didn't necessarily participate in it, but they knew that it was happening. They knew these girls were being abused at a sadistic and systemic level, and they did nothing to stop it. They did nothing to alert officials. You see officials, you see the FBI, you see local DAs, other groups. All they're doing is streamlining the Epstein operation. They're making sure he gets the most minimal sentence possible. They're making sure that the girls' testimonies and their stories are suppressed. They're getting death threats. Their families are getting death threats. Everyone's living in this environment where they're being told, you better keep your mouth shut, or that's the end for you. And it goes on for decades on end. And, the moment it really struck me that like how deep it was the 2016 election, because a lot of this was out in the open already by then, and part of it because of the efforts of Nick Bryan, releasing Epstein's contact list onto Gawker. Gawker then, of course, was immediately sued by Peter Thiel, under the premise of the Hulk Hogan case, and Thiel's own objections to some things Gawker had written about him. But in the end, it happened shortly after this Epstein list, so that had made me wonder. But what it meant, though, is that the mainstream media had access to a lot of information about Epstein. They always had. They could have used it against Trump, or not even against Trump. They could have accurately documented Trump's ties to Epstein. They could have accurately documented Bill Clinton's ties to Epstein and asked Hillary Clinton, hey, did you know about this? What was this relationship like? They stayed away from this almost entirely. It only came up kind of toward the end, after Trump's grab him by the pussy video comment ignited a lot of women coming forward saying he had sexually assaulted them. But I just was like, this is it. Like, this is very serious. And this isn't just a matter. I mean, it's bad enough that it's a matter of child abuse, but it's also a matter of espionage. It's a matter of organized crime. It's a matter of foreign infiltration of our country. All these different issues are tied up here. If they're not going to address it now, then I didn't think that they would address it. And then, of course, I think Epstein, what happened in 2019 was a catch and kill. It was a way to control that narrative, to make it go from something that was suppressed into something that was so ubiquitous with so many conflicting accounts that it's just memed into inscrutability. It just becomes jokes. It becomes this little funny thing people say. Epstein didn't commit suicide, but, he probably didn't. And that's a serious thing, because it makes you wonder, well, then what happened to him, and who helped out there, and what are they doing, and are they in a position of power, and do they have the capacity to hurt people, which I feel like should be the question asked of everybody. Can they hurt people? Are people suffering because of this individual's access to power? It doesn't matter what party they're in. Like, that is the question that needs to be asked.
Yeah, people have died, and important figures in this history of the U.S. clandestine regime, or the deep state, whatever we want to call it, have died in state custody. I mean, Oswald, Ruby, Jack Ruby, the guy that kills Oswald, dies in state custody very precipitously, even though he had spoken of being party to a conspiracy, and he'd asked the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, can you take me to Washington so I can talk? My life's in danger here. And that he had been deemed insane by psychiatrist Jolyon West, who said that, I visited him and he was in the midst of a psychotic episode. And then, of course, now we know he's the guy who went around dosing everybody with acid. Right. And even an elephant. He killed an elephant with acid, which is quite something to think about. And yet, even though we know these things, we can't do anything about them. The Jack Ruby thing, the story of Jack Ruby, if you read Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, especially, because Peter goes into this kind of complex backstory, but that was, I think, the most brazen act, because you kill the president's assassin with this person, and it's not as if the person is like, you can just really explain it as he's a weird lone nut. He actually ties into the heart of the National Crime Syndicate. For access to the rest of this episode and the rest of our vast and growing library, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I also want to express my deep appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers on Patreon. Please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. American Exception exists thanks to our Patreon subscribers. On YouTube, we will never be viable. You may notice that we have dropped the Devil's Chess Club title from these episodes. After David Talbot had to leave our team due to his second, more debilitating stroke, I kept the Devil's Chess Club name and theme song and intro. I didn't want to close the book on David's partnership with Bryce and me. I had hopes that he would return. David and I had planned to write 2 books together after 2024, one on the ultra-Zionist neocon takeover of U.S. foreign policy, and another on the RFK assassination. It now seems very unlikely that David will return to podcasting or to writing. As such, it didn't make sense to keep using the Devil's Chess Club brand. Still, to pay homage to David and the outstanding books that David wrote with his wonderful research assistant, Karen Croft, we're going to keep using the Devil's Chess Club theme song intro for our video episodes. David, if you're listening, know that we miss you very much. Finally, and again, please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Subscribe so that American Exception can continue to mind the darkness.